Deep within the arid caves near the Dead Sea, between the jagged cliffs of Qumran and the Judean desert, thousands of fragments of parchment, papyrus and copper lay in absolute silence for 2 millennia. They were not treasures of gold. They were words, fragmented lines of ancient Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek, shattered yet powerful enough to shake the foundations of biblical scholarship. For decades, scholars believed the narrative was settled. These scrolls reflected an ancient Jewish community, painstakingly copied by diverse scribes over centuries, dated firmly by traditional paleography and radiocarbon testing. Then artificial intelligence stepped in, not to translate a new verse or unearth a hidden prophecy, but to do something far more calculated, to measure the ink. If a microscopic stroke, a slant of a letter, or the spacing between characters could betray a manuscript's true age, what happens if our dating is off by decades? If thousands of fragments once attributed to countless unrelated hands actually point to a highly disciplined, centralized scriptorium, are we looking at a scattered library or something far more coordinated? This isn't about AI solving the mystery. It is about AI challenging the bedrock of history. When were they written? Who held the pen? Are these texts older than we ever imagined? The Dead Sea Scrolls were the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. But in the 21st century, the smallest strokes of ink are rewriting the story we thought was already finished. In the late 1940s, a Bedouin shepherd chasing a stray goat tossed a stone into a dark cliffside cave near Qumran, on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The sound of shattering pottery that echoed back would signal the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Inside clay jars lay brittle scrolls of ancient leather and papyrus, preserved by the dry desert air. Over the following decade, 11 caves yielded hundreds of manuscripts and tens of thousands of disintegrated fragments. This was not a mere collection of verses. It was an unprecedented ancient library containing the earliest known copies of the Hebrew Bible, community rule books, apocalyptic apocrypha, and detailed calendars. Before this discovery, the oldest surviving complete Hebrew Bible manuscripts dated only to the 10th century AD. The Dead Sea Scrolls shattered this timeline, pushing textual evidence back more than 1,000 years, right into the turbulent era surrounding the life of Jesus. They provided a radical, unfiltered window into a highly diverse and fractured ancient Judaism, a time of competing sects, parallel textual traditions, and intense apocalyptic expectation. For decades, the dominant theory tied these texts to the Essenes, an ascetic Jewish sect that retreated to Qumran to live in isolation. Scholars hypothesized that they fastidiously copied, studied, and eventually hid this library in the caves to protect it from the advancing Roman legions. Yet, counter-theories persisted, with some arguing the scrolls were smuggled out of Jerusalem libraries during the Roman siege. Despite 70 years of intense scrutiny, 3 questions never truly closed. Over what precise span of time was this entire library created? Exactly how many individual scribes held the pens, and what are the absolute dates of the most critical texts? Historically, answers rested entirely on human eyes, the subjective judgment of paleographers examining ink styles and historians debating pottery shapes. But human perception has its limits. The Dead Sea Scrolls present a daunting puzzle. Thousands of fragments are microscopic, faded and heavily damaged, while many scribes copied with deceptive similarity. Where human eyesight hits an evolutionary wall of doubt, a new kind of vision is required. The limits of traditional paleography. The primary weapon in the scholarly arsenal was traditional paleography, the meticulous study of ancient handwriting. To determine when a scroll was written, experts spent lifetimes scrutinizing the precise morphology of individual letters, the slant and trajectory of ink strokes, the subtle ligatures connecting characters, the evolution of Hasmonean and Herodian script styles. While foundational, This method inherently harbored a critical flaw. It relied heavily on subjective intuition, academic authority, and comparative analysis with a highly limited pool of known reference points. The radiocarbon dilemma. To inject hard science into the debate, some fragments underwent radiocarbon dating. However, this method introduced its own compromises. First, carbon dating requires destroying a physical sample, an agonizing trade-off when dealing with priceless, irreplaceable antiquity. Second, many fragments discovered in the mid-20th century had been treated with modern preservatives, oils, and chemical stabilizers, which heavily contaminated the organic layers and skewed modern testing variables. Why a few decades change everything? Consequently, the consensus placement of the scrolls spanned a broad window from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. For microscopic fragments, this timeline was often a generous estimate, leaving a margin of error of up to 100 years. In the realm of textual criticism, a shift of just 30 years is seismic. If a manuscript is dated after a major historical crisis, it represents a reaction or a later copy. But if it predates that crisis, it stands as primary evidence of an older, unadulterated tradition. A younger timeline can demote a scroll to a mere commentary. An older timeline forces us to completely rewrite the evolution of biblical scripture. The illusion of the shared pen. The same visual ambiguity plagued the identification of the scribes. Human eyes categorized texts based on superficial similarities. If two manuscripts shared a similar aesthetic, scholars assumed a single author or a shared school. But this failed to account for ancient mimicry. When two scribes are rigorously trained in the exact same scriptorium to suppress their individuality and replicate an institutional hand, the human eye reaches a point of absolute cognitive blindness. The pivot. This is where artificial intelligence enters the dark rooms of history. AI does not operate on reputation, academic consensus, or intuition. It acts as an unyielding engine of measurement. It strips away the romance of the scrolls and asks a single cold question. Do these ink strokes actually match, or has humanity been falling for an ancient illusion? Shape over meaning. The geometric awakening artificial intelligence does not approach the Dead Sea Scrolls as a historian, a theologian, or a linguist. It doesn't begin by asking, what does this text say? Instead, it cold-bloodedly asks, what hand forged this stroke? To the algorithm, the sacred scripts are stripped of their theological weight and transformed into pure geometry, the quantifiable pen. Every single letter is treated as a complex, multi-dimensional object. Every ink deposit on parchment becomes a coordinates-mapped data set. Micrometrics, variables that human biology is physically incapable of measuring with consistency. The microcurvature of a stroke, the variable thickness of ink deposits, the exact angle of pen-to-surface contact, and the implicit velocity of the writer's wrist are translated into absolute, unarguable numerical values. The machine does not read the ink. It measures the biometric signature left behind by a biological entity 2,000 years ago. Digital paleography, decoding the biometric scribe by converting handwriting into digital data. AI tracks microscopic anomalies across thousands of fragments. Human vision operates on macro patterns. We notice the general shape of a letter, aleph, or bet. The AI, however, looks at the invisible margins of habit. Digital paleography, decoding the biometric scribe by converting handwriting into digital data. AI tracks microscopic anomalies across thousands of fragments. Human vision operates on macro patterns. We notice the general shape of a letter for aleph, or bet. The AI, however, looks at the invisible margins of habit. It monitors the subtle degradation of a writer's hand over time, the shifting of styles between text columns, and the unconscious muscle memory that the human scribe cannot consciously alter or suppress. When an ancient scribe actively tried to hide their identity by mimicking an institutional style, their biometric baseline, the unique neuromuscular rhythm, remained encoded in the ink. The AI extracts this ghost from the machine, the great Isaiah scroll, cracking the optical illusion. The power of this methodology was profoundly proven when researchers applied it to the great Isaiah scroll, one of the most pristine and iconic manuscripts recovered from Cave 1. For over half a century, mainstream academia maintained that this massive 24-foot-long parchment was the masterwork of a single, highly skilled individual. The script appeared perfectly uniform from beginning to end. The AI shattered this illusion. By analyzing the structural patterns of the letters across all 54 columns, the algorithm identified a systematic, mathematically undeniable shift in the handwriting metrics precisely at the halfway point, right around column 27. The data revealed that the scroll was actually the product of two distinct individuals. Scribe B had been so meticulously trained to mimic Scribe A that their stylistic choices were virtually indistinguishable to human eyes. This discovery fundamentally redefines our understanding of ancient text production. The great Isaiah scroll was not an isolated product of a lonely hermit. It was the output of a highly sophisticated, synchronized, and disciplined copying operation, where individual identity was deliberately erased to maintain institutional continuity. The Enoch model, rewriting the timeline of faith. Once the AI demonstrated its ability to isolate individual scribes, scientists weaponized it against the ultimate archaeological mystery, the absolute timeline of the scrolls. This gave birth to the Enoch model. The Enoch model was trained on a rigid baseline of manuscripts whose ages had already been verified through rigorous radiocarbon testing. The neural network mapped out how specific letter shapes, stroke trajectories, and linguistic scripts shifted across time, establishing a precise evolutionary trajectory of ancient writing. When this predictive model was unleashed upon the vast library of undated, fragmented scrolls, the results sent shockwaves through the academic world. The chronological shift. The AI systematically pushed the dates of several critical biblical and sectarian manuscripts significantly further back into the past than traditional paleography had ever allowed. The historical reevaluation. Many scrolls were unmasked as being decades, sometimes nearly a century older than previously assumed. If a prophetic or legal text was written significantly earlier than we thought, it means the theological ideas, apocalyptic expectations, and structural laws once believed to have evolved late were actually thriving much earlier. We're no longer looking at late-stage reactions to history, we are looking at the foundational architecture of ancient faith, the temporal footprint. Ultimately, artificial intelligence did not unearth a hidden unread word within the fibers of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It achieved something far more profound. It discovered a secret layer of time deeply embedded within the physical kinetic motion of a human hand that has been dust for 2 millennia. For decades, scholars boxed the Dead Sea Scrolls into fixed historical boundaries. By using traditional paleography, they compartmentalized the manuscripts into neat, rigid labels, the Hasmonean period or the later Herodian period. The rules of human judgment were absolute. If a script looked highly developed, it simply could not be assigned an early date. But when artificial intelligence cross-referenced the physical strokes with clean radiocarbon data, it shattered this artificial timeline. The algorithm systematically dragged several critical manuscripts out of their late-stage classifications and threw them decades back into the past. In biblical archaeology, a shift in chronology changes everything. Date is not just a number, it is the lens through which history is interpreted. If a text is written after a historical event, it is mere reaction or commentary. But if it is written before, it transforms into an early witness, proving that complex theological concepts and stabilized scriptures were thriving much earlier than once believed. If the machine is correct, the Dead Sea Scrolls are no longer the late scattered survival library of a fringe sect. They are absolute proof that ancient traditions emerged earlier, stabilized faster, and were copied systematically far beyond the boundaries of our accepted history. For generations, the sheer volume of the Dead Sea Scrolls led scholars to a natural conclusion. This vast, fragmented library was the work of countless individual scribes, a chaotic mosaic of texts gathered from diverse sources. But when AI analyzed the biometric fingerprints embedded in the ink, it flipped the script. The algorithm didn't just count manuscripts, it identified the actual flesh and blood writers. The data suggests a radical alternative. Many of these scrolls were produced by far fewer hands than ever imagined. Picture a silent, ancient room, no printing presses, no digital archives. Every holy character must be forged by hand, where a single error could defile a sacred line. If the AI is correct, these ancient scribes were trained to actively suppress their individuality, transforming their personal handwriting into a flawless collective style. The scrolls are no longer a random, scattered horde hidden in panic. They are the calculated output of a highly centralized system, an ancient institutional copying machine operated by human hands, governed by rigid standards, strict quality control, and an uncompromising vow of textual preservation. For over half a century, traditional paleography treated the evolution of ancient handwriting like a straight line. Scribes supposedly moved neatly from the early Hasmonean style to the transitional phases, and finally to the late Herodian script. It was a clean, orderly evolutionary tree. But when AI mapped the microvariants of thousands of letters, it completely tangled that linear tree. The algorithmic analysis suggests a chaotic reality. Script styles did not evolve in a vacuum or a tidy sequence. Instead, they overlapped, coexisted, and collided. A supposedly late script style might have thrived decades earlier, and two styles once locked into separate centuries may have been used simultaneously in the exact same scriptorium. This forces a profound reassessment of text-based dating. Human experts didn't fail. They simply lacked the computational power to measure thousands of microscopic strokes and process them through probability matrices. History is rarely a straight line. With the help of AI, we are finally realizing that the evolution of ancient writing was never a clean highway, but a dense, hyper-complex network. The monument of uniformity among the hundreds of manuscripts recovered from the dark limestone caves of Qumran. One artifact stands as the undisputed crown jewel of biblical archaeology, the Great Isaiah Scroll, $1 Quisa circumflex $1. Stretching over 24 feet of stitched parchment, it contains the near-complete text of the Book of Isaiah. For more than half a century, it has served as the definitive baseline for verifying the miraculous preservation of the Hebrew Bible across 2 millennia. To the human eye, the scroll is a masterpiece of consistency. Generation after generation of elite biblical scholars and paleographers scrutinized its 54 columns of elegant script, arriving at what seemed to be an unshakable conclusion. This monumental text was the life's work of a single, deeply disciplined master scribe. The aesthetic rhythm was too flawless, the spacing too perfect, and the character shapes too uniform to suggest otherwise. Humanity read the scroll and saw a solitary hand, the algorithmic fracture. Then, the artificial neural networks were unleashed upon the high-resolution digital scans of the ancient leather. The AI did not read the ancient warnings of the prophet Isaiah. Instead, it extracted the biometric coordinates of every individual character, tracking the physical footprint of the ink. What the machine detected completely shattered 50 years of academic consensus. As the algorithm processed the columns from right to left, it identified a systematic, mathematically undeniable statistical fracture precisely at the halfway mark. right around column 2:7. It was not a glaring error. There was no marginal note, no sudden change in ink colour, and no change in text size. It was an invisible break, a microscopic shift in the specific way the loops of the letters were closed, the subtle pressure gradient applied to the pen and the micro-angles of the ink strokes, the mask of the scriptorium. This subtle fracture reveals a stunning historical reality. Scribe A laid down his pen at column 27 and Scribe B stepped in to finish the scroll. But Scribe B did not write with his own casual handwriting. He wrote behind a mask. He had been so meticulously trained, so brutally disciplined in the exact same tradition that he was able to seamlessly mimic Scribe A's style, preserving the illusion of a single author dot. This single data point completely redefines our understanding of how the roots of Western scripture were manufactured. It proves that copying sacred texts was not the lonely, isolated task of eccentric hermits living out in the wilderness. It was a highly sophisticated, institutionalized collective endeavor. The text was preserved not just through memory, but through an absolute unyielding discipline of physical form. Individual identity was completely suppressed to serve the continuity of the sacred word. 2 hands, 1 voice. For 70 years, humanity stared directly at the great Isaiah scroll, looking for theological meaning in its verses and prophecies. Yet the AI managed to look through the meaning to find a deeply human story written entirely in the kinetic movement of the hand. One man stops. Another man begins. 2 distinct human hearts. 2 different biological hands. 1 single, unyielding voice. They wrote with a shared purpose so absolute that they successfully fooled the greatest minds of the modern world for over half a century. The invisible handshake. Ultimately, the most profound secret of the great Isaiah scroll does not reside in its sweeping apocalyptic visions or its ancient words. It lives in that silent, invisible moment at column 27, the exact coordinate where one anonymous hand gracefully yielded the pen to another, leaving a biometric handshake that was buried in the ink for 2,000 years, waiting for an artificial mind to finally read it. The evolutionary findings of neural networks have not been met with universal applause. Within the quiet corridors of mainstream academia, a necessary skepticism remains. Elite historians argue that while an algorithm can effortlessly isolate structural metrics, it remains blind to the chaotic variables of organic human life. They raise fundamental cautions. AI models are constrained by limited ancient datasets, and paper decay can easily distort ink trajectories. More importantly, biological scribes do not write like predictable modern printers. A single individual's hand naturally fluctuates due to aging, physical fatigue, a blunt reed pen, or the psychological trauma of a historic crisis. This exposes the core paradox. AI is a master of mathematical pattern recognition, but it possesses zero comprehension of historical or theological context. The algorithm can prove a 98% dollar stroke uniformity, but it cannot answer why ultimately, the burning question is not whether the machine or the human eye holds the monopoly on historical truth. The real debate is, are we willing to confine the past to the limits of human eyesight, or will we allow the ancient ink to speak through the unyielding precision of data? 10. For decades, the Dead Sea Scrolls were viewed as a chaotic ark of survival, a massive, disparate library of religious texts, copied by countless hands over generations, hidden in panic during a time of war. But AI has exposed a much deeper, hidden architecture beneath the fragments. For decades, the Dead Sea Scrolls were viewed as a chaotic ark of survival, a massive, disparate library of religious texts, copied by countless hands over generations, hidden in panic during a time of war. But AI has exposed a much deeper, hidden architecture beneath the fragments, the machine suggests a radical counter-narrative. This library was not a random hoard. It was the deliberate output of a highly centralized, institutionalized ancient scriptorium that operated much earlier and with far greater discipline than history ever recorded. Everything we thought we knew has been flipped. A vast multitude of fragments does not equal chaos. Deceptively similar handwriting does not equal a single author, but rather a brutal collective training. And supposedly late script styles do not automatically mean a late-stage text. AI hasn't turned the scrolls into a supernatural mystery. It has done something far more terrifying. It has converted human handwriting into ironclad historical data, forcing us to confront the fact that the oldest library on Earth was far more sophisticated, organized, and coordinated than humanity ever dared to imagine. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived for nearly 2 millennia by the sheer grace of historical accident, guarded by the absolute darkness of limestone caves and preserved by the dry, unyielding desert air. Yet the most profound realization of our time is that after all these centuries, these ancient parchments have not finished telling their story. In the 20th century, human hands finally uncovered them. For decades, elite scholars read, translated, restored, and fiercely debated their textual contents. But in the 21st century, artificial intelligence has begun to read something else entirely. Not the holy words themselves, but the raw kinetic momentum that forged them. A microscopic curvature of a letter, a subtle spacing habit between words, an invisible fracture between two text columns, a sophisticated script style emerging decades earlier than expected, an anonymous hand that held a pen far longer than we ever knew. The algorithms may stumble on certain variables, and future data sets will undoubtedly recalibrate these initial predictions, but the gate has been violently thrown open. The Dead Sea Scrolls are no longer dead, static texts frozen behind museum glass. They have transformed into a living, breathing database where a single millimeter of ancient ink can completely rewrite chronological timelines, identity attributions, and the evolutionary history of ancient faiths. Ultimately, the burning question is not whether machine vision will conquer human scholarship. The real question is far more haunting. If technology can extract historical truths from handwriting that human eyes have missed for 70 years, how much of our global history is sitting right in front of us, waiting for us to finally learn how to read it? Is artificial intelligence truly rewriting the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or is it merely painting a new layer of computational illusion over these sacred texts? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.